Good afternoon. I am Commander Suzanne Walkoff. I will be presenting today along with my colleague, Carol DeLima, on gluten-free food labeling. Carol and I work in the Office of Nutrition, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. The focus of our presentation is as follows. First, I will provide an overview of the major legislative and other activities that preceded the Food and Drug Administration's rulemaking on gluten-free food labeling. Next, Carol will explain the final rule for gluten-free labeling. Then, Carol will discuss the current status of FDA's proposed rule for gluten-free labeling of hydrolyzed, fermented, and distilled foods. And lastly, I will provide an overview of FDA's enforcement of the final rule for gluten-free food labeling. But first, we're going to take a poll on what you know concerning the subject. You should see the poll open up on the left of your screen. So our first poll is, which grain would be prohibited on a gluten-free diet? A, wheat, B, triticale, C, rye, D, barley, or E, all of the above. We'll come back to this answer in a few minutes. So let's discuss some of the events that preceded FDA's gluten-free food labeling rulemaking. A law called the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004 directed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to undertake rulemaking to define and permit the use of the food labeling term gluten-free. FDA is serving as the Secretary's designee to comply with the mandate and consider persons with celiac disease to be the primary target population to benefit from this rulemaking. Similar to food allergies, celiac disease has no cure. Dietary avoidance of gluten is the only way to prevent the harmful health effects of this disease. The term gluten is commonly used to collectively refer to particular proteins that naturally occur in certain grains, and that can damage the lining of the small intestine as well as adversely affect other organs of the body when consumed by persons with celiac disease. Preceding this rulemaking, FDA reviewed the scientific literature about the association between gluten intake and celiac disease. Because there was no consensus opinion among medical experts about what the term gluten-free should mean, in June 2005, the agency drafted a report entitled Approaches to Establish Thresholds for Major Food Allergens and for Gluten in Food. This is referred to as the Thresholds Report. This report identified 4 possible approaches that FDA could consider to establish a gluten threshold level as a criterion to define the term gluten-free. In July 2005, FDA held a public meeting of its Food Advisory Committee that reviewed the draft Thresholds Report and concluded that it was scientifically sound. FDA issued a revised Thresholds Report in March 2006 to discuss comments it received from committee members and the public. In August 2005, FDA held another meeting open to the public and invited speakers to address different questions published in the related Federal Register notice that solicited comments. These questions concerned the manufacturing of gluten-free foods, consumer purchasing practices and views about gluten-free foods, and analytical methods designed to detect gluten in foods. FDA published a proposed rule to define the term gluten-free on January 23, 2007, which provided a 90-day comment period that ended on April 23, 2007. On the same day the proposal was issued, we posted at our website a series of questions and answers that explains the rule's major provisions. And FDA had received about 750 public comments in response to this proposal. Now we'll take a look at the results of our poll. The answer is E, all of the above. And it looks like the majority of you got it correct. FDA proposed to define the term prohibited grain to mean the following: wheat, which is any species of grain belonging to the genus Triticum; rye, which is any species of grain belonging to the genus Sakali; barley, which is any genus of grain belonging to the genus Hordeum, or any crossbred hybrid of these three grains. For example, triticale is a cross between wheat and rye. FDA proposed to define the term gluten to mean the protein that naturally occurs in a prohibited grain and that may cause adverse health effects in persons with celiac disease. We cited examples of two categories of such proteins, prolamins and glutenins, that have been reported in the scientific literature to be problematic for persons with celiac disease. FDA proposed to define a gluten-free food to mean a food cannot contain any one of the following: ingredients that are a prohibited grain, and an example would be spelt wheat, or ingredients derived from a prohibited grain that have not been processed to remove gluten, and this example would be wheat flour, or ingredients derived from a prohibited grain that have been processed to remove gluten. For example, wheat starch, if the use of that ingredient results in the presence of 20 parts per million or more gluten in the finished food, or 20 parts per million or more gluten is present. FDA used the analytical methods-based approach to establish a 20 parts per million gluten threshold level as one of the criteria to define gluten-free. This approach represents one of the two identified in the thresholds report that was deemed feasible. FDA also discussed in the proposal that the agency has tentatively determined that enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay-based methods, ELISA-based methods, can be used reliably and consistently to detect gluten at the level of 20 parts per million or more in a variety of foods, including those that are raw, cooked, and baked. To FDA's knowledge, 20 parts per million is currently the lowest level at which an ELISA-based method to detect gluten has been validated, where the results have been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The Federal Register Notice provides FDA rationale for using an analytical methods-based approach to establish a gluten threshold level to define the term gluten-free. One of the reasons is that less than 20 parts per million gluten is consistent with international standards based upon Codex's definition of gluten-free that are adopted by 27 countries in Europe. Another reason is that less than 20 parts per million gluten is consistent with the statements and some epidemiologic evidence reported in the scientific literature that suggests that the trace amount of gluten that persons with celiac disease can safely tolerate is variable, and that less than 20 parts per million gluten falls within this range. Further, to FDA's knowledge, analytical methods have not been validated to consistently and reliably detect gluten at levels less than 20 parts per million. As a regulatory agency, FDA routinely uses validated methods when we analyze products for compliance with our labeling and other requirements. Other reasons supporting FDA's use of an analytical methods-based approach to set a less than 20 parts per million gluten threshold level is the agency's uncertainty about manufacturers of multi-ingredient foods, especially grain-based products, to meet a lower gluten threshold level. We are unsure of the possible unintended consequences adopting a lower gluten threshold level may have, such as if it would make it more difficult or costly for those with celiac disease to adhere lifelong to a gluten-free diet. If there is an increase in the prevalence of persons with celiac disease not adhering to a gluten-free diet, they could actually be placed at higher risk of developing serious health complications and other diseases associated with celiac disease. If FDA could indeed force a gluten threshold level lower than 20 parts per million, the agency questions whether this would influence some U.S. food manufacturers to discontinue labeling their products gluten-free because they cannot consistently meet a lower gluten level. Also, it could discourage other U.S. food companies from becoming new manufacturers of products labeled gluten-free. In addition, it could result in a significant increase in the costs of both the consumer and the manufacturer of foods labeled gluten-free, and it could negatively impact international trade of foods labeled gluten-free, thereby affecting the availability of certain foods to persons with celiac disease residing in the United States. On August 3, 2011, FDA published a Federal Register notice that announced the availability of and solicited public comments on the gluten report and a number of specific issues about defining the term gluten-free. This notice provided a 60-day comment period which closed on October 3rd. The day before this notice was published, FDA did the following as a way to alert the public about the upcoming notice. We held a stakeholders conference call. We posted a series of questions and answers about the Federal Register notice at our website, and we issued a news release and related FDA consumer update on August 2, 2011. FDA's overall position on defining gluten-free is as follows. As stated in the Federal Register notice, the agency stated that they will remain open to the feasibility and desirability of revising the gluten threshold level that is adopted in the final rule to define the term gluten-free, considering the following: the availability of more sensitive analytical methods that can detect gluten, and further research on celiac disease in the future that indicates that use of a lower gluten threshold level is warranted to be adequately protective of the celiac disease population. I want to emphasize that it is FDA's primary goal in its rulemaking to define the term gluten-free in a way that protects the vast majority of persons with celiac disease without unnecessarily restricting their food choices or making it more difficult or costly for them to adhere lifelong to a gluten-free diet. Now I'm going to turn over the presentation to Carol DeLima, who will discuss the gluten-free final rule and gluten-free labeling of hydrolyzed, fermented, and distilled foods. Please give us a minute to transition speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol DeLima, and as Suzanne said, I will discuss FDA's gluten-free food labeling final rule, and I will also give a little update on the status of gluten-free labeling of hydrolyzed and fermented foods. But let me start with a poll question to test your knowledge on gluten-free labeling. So is this statement true or false? Gluten-free is the only term I can use to indicate that my food product is gluten-free and meets all the requirements of FDA's gluten-free food labeling final rule. Your options are A, true, or B, false. Again, you'll see the poll question on the left-hand side, and we will come back to the answer in a few minutes. So we received about 750 comments to the proposed rule during the 90-day public comment period and used them all to help us in finalizing the gluten-free final rule. I will now go into further detail about some of those comments and the changes made to the final rule. As mentioned earlier, we were using the term prohibited grains to describe the grains that contain gluten. Several comments stated that the term prohibited grain was inappropriate since the grains were not prohibited for all, just for those with celiac disease. So in the gluten-free final rule, we replaced the term prohibited grain with gluten-containing grain, and we finalized the remaining definition of gluten-containing grain without change. So you can see here how gluten-containing grain is defined in the final rule. It would refer to grains such as wheat, rye, and barley, or any crossbred hybrid of these three grains. The definition of gluten stayed the same. That is, gluten is defined as the proteins that naturally occur in a gluten-containing grain and that may cause adverse health effects in persons with celiac disease. Examples are prolamines and glutelins. Many commenters requested a clean and consistent definition for gluten-free labeling claim and asked us to avoid ambiguous statements such as no gluten added or made from gluten-free ingredients. So in the final rule, we included 4 acceptable terms: gluten-free, no gluten, free of gluten, or without gluten. Therefore, FDA's final rule states that a food that bears any of these 4 claims in its labeling and fails to meet the requirements of the gluten-free rule would be deemed misbranded. This is a change from what we initially proposed, which was that the definition would apply to the terms gluten-free or similar claims. However, because of comments we received, we narrowed the specific terms that would be considered gluten-free. Other than these 4 terms, we discouraged the use of labeling statements about the gluten content of food and would evaluate any such statements on an individual basis. The hope is that this will help individuals with celiac disease identify foods that they can tolerate without having to wonder whether different label claims present different risks and thus manage their diets more easily. So now for the results of the poll question. It looks like some of you got the answer right. A majority of you got it right. So the answer is false. Gluten is not the only term you can use to make a gluten-free claim, as I mentioned in the last slide. You can also use any one of the other 3 terms I mentioned earlier, that is no gluten, free of gluten, or without gluten. So moving on, even though it was not discussed in our proposed rule, there were several comments regarding the use of a universal symbol or logo. Many comments requested that we establish a universal logo or symbol and or standardized print format for all manufacturers who wish to make a gluten-free claim on their food labels. The comments said that it would make it easier for consumers to identify gluten-free foods and reduce shopping time or confusion. There were also some comments that opposed the use of symbols due to various reasons. Since we did not have any data indicating that mandating a universal symbol or logo was necessary to ensure that the claim was not false or misleading, we did not establish a universal symbol or logo. We are aware of several companies or organizations that have developed specific symbols or phrases to indicate adherence to their own standards or standards of an independent gluten-free certification program. We do not endorse any of these symbols or logos, and we would review the use of any gluten-related claim not addressed in our final rule on a case-by-case basis. So there was a lot of uncertainty when it came to the topic of oats. In our proposed rule, we stated that a food made from oats that bore a gluten-free claim would be deemed misbranded if the claim suggested that all such foods were gluten-free or if 20 parts per million or more gluten was present in the food. And we asked for comments from the public on this. However, most comments supported the inclusion of oats as an ingredient in gluten-free label foods because the majority of individuals suffering from celiac disease are able to tolerate oats. In addition to this, oats contribute essential nutrients and fiber to a gluten-free diet, as well as more dietary variety. Some oppose permitting oats in a food labeled gluten-free as well, due to various reasons. While oats are inherently gluten-free, we recognize that some oats may come in contact with gluten-containing grains during their production, processing, and storage, or other handling practices. However, the commingling of oats with other grains appears to be preventable. Therefore, we agreed with the comments that oats may be used as an ingredient in a food labeled as gluten-free, provided that the food meets the definition of gluten-free, and made this change in the final rule. In the proposed rule, we stated that a food would be misbranded if it bore a gluten-free claim in its labeling if the food was inherently free of gluten, and if the claim did not refer to all foods of that same type. An example of what we were requiring would be if a manufacturer wished to use a gluten-free claim on a package of milk, which is a food that is inherently free of gluten, we would require additional qualifying language to indicate this, such as milk, a gluten-free food, or all milk is gluten-free. We invited comments and scientific information from the public on whether a gluten-free claim on a food that was inherently free of gluten would be misleading in the absence of additional qualifying language. While some comments supported this decision, most expressed significant confusion over it. Taking the comments into consideration, we saw how the requirement for qualifying language on gluten-free label foods that inherently did not contain gluten could be interpreted as saying that it is the nature of the food rather than the care provided by the company making the gluten-free claim that ensured the product met the definition. We also agreed with the comments that such qualified labeling on one brand of food that inherently did not contain gluten could mislead consumers into assuming that a gluten-containing version of that product was also gluten-free. Consequently, we decided that a gluten-free claim without qualifying language on a food that was inherently free of gluten was not misleading and made appropriate revisions to our final rule. Therefore, in the final rule, a food that was inherently free of gluten and labeled as gluten-free must meet the definition of gluten-free, but will not require additional qualifying language. So here's your next poll question to see if you understood that. My product is inherently gluten-free. Can it still bear a gluten-free claim, or would that be confusing to consumers? Your options are A, yes, or B, no. Again, the poll question appears on the left of the screen, and we'll come back to the answer in a few minutes. While drafting the final rule, we became aware that for fermented or hydrolyzed foods, it was not possible to measure intact gluten using currently available analytical methods. This is due to the fact that proteins are broken down during the process of fermentation and hydrolysis, and the gluten is no longer intact, making current methods ineffective in detecting and quantifying gluten protein content in these foods. Therefore, we stated in the final rule that we would engage in additional rulemaking to establish how we would determine compliance for hydrolyzed and fermented foods, and we have been working on drafting this proposed rule since the final rule was published. Some examples of these kinds of foods are yogurt, cheese, and sauerkraut. In addition, many comments to the proposed rule express concern over gluten-free labeling of distilled vinegar. Since distillation is a purification process, it is unlikely that gluten is present in distilled vinegar, provided the distillation is conducted following good manufacturing practices specific to distillation. Since all vinegars are fermented but not all are distilled, we intend to address how FDA will evaluate compliance of vinegars and other distilled foods in the proposed rule for labeling of hydrolyzed and fermented foods as well. Also, there are some beers that are subject to FDA's regulations. These are beers that are made from either malted barley and no hops, or with substitutes for malted barley with or without hops. Since beer is a fermented food, these would also be covered in the hydrolyzed and fermented foods proposed rule that is currently under development. We are in the final stages of the proposed rule for gluten-free labeling of hydrolyzed and fermented foods. Again, the purpose of this proposed rule is to establish the criteria FDA will use to determine compliance for hydrolyzed, fermented, and distilled foods or foods that contain these ingredients. This proposed rule does not change any of the existing definitions or requirements of the final rule. Additionally, we will be proposing record-keeping requirements for hydrolyzed and fermented foods. For distilled foods, we will require scientifically valid methods that can demonstrate that all protein, and therefore all gluten, has been removed by the distillation process. Our draft is currently with the Office of Management and Budget for review, and we're hoping it will be published soon. After which, there will be an opportunity for the public to comment, as with all other rules. While the proposed rule is under review, we are not able to discuss the specifics of the content in case any changes are made before publication. Meanwhile, until we establish provisions specifically for these foods, as is true for all manufacturers who wish to use gluten-free labeling on their foods, manufacturers of fermented, hydrolyzed foods or foods that use these ingredients are responsible for ensuring that the food bearing a gluten-free claim is not misbranded for failure to meet all the requirements of the final rule. Manufacturers can implement measures that are necessary to prevent the introduction of gluten into the food, ensuring any finished product will comply with the definition. So the results of the poll question, the answer is yes. Your product can be labeled as gluten-free if it is inherently free of gluten, and it looks like most of you got that answer correct. Okay, so following the revisions, these are the major provisions of FDA's gluten-free food labeling final rule. Food with any whole gluten-containing grain like spelt or wheat as ingredients may not bear the gluten-free claim. Foods with ingredients that are gluten-containing grains that are refined but still contain gluten, example wheat flour, also may not bear the gluten-free claim. And foods with ingredients that are gluten-containing grains that have been refined in such a way to remove gluten may use the claim so long as the food contains less than 20 parts per million of gluten. An example of this would be wheat starch. Also, foods that inherently do not contain gluten may use the gluten-free claim. And finally, foods may not use the claim if they contain 20 parts per million or more gluten as a result of cross-contact with gluten-containing grains. Also in our final rule, you will see that it states that a food whose labeling includes the term wheat in the ingredients list or in a separate contains wheat statement as required by the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, or FALPA, and also bears a gluten-free claim will be deemed misbranded unless its labeling also bears additional clarifying language such as this statement below. saying that the wheat has been processed to allow the food to meet FDA's requirements for a gluten-free claim. The gluten-free food labeling final rule applies mainly to packaged foods, which some of those packaged foods may be sold in a retail or food service establishment, such as some carry-out restaurants. As far as other restaurants are concerned, given the public health significance of gluten-free labeling, we say that restaurants making a gluten-free claim on the menus should be consistent with FDA's definition. FDA will continue to work with, educate, and monitor industry on the use of the gluten-free claim. So here's your last poll question. My product contains wheat starch and therefore no gluten. Can I label it as gluten-free if it has less than 20 parts per million gluten? Your options are A, yes, your product may bear the gluten-free claim only if it also bears the appropriate disclaimer required by FDA. B, no, your product may not bear the gluten-free claim. Or C, yes, your product may bear the gluten-free claim and there is no other requirement. Again, we'll come back to the answer in a couple of slides. The gluten-free food labeling final rule was issued in August 2013. The rule is intended to help consumers, especially those living with celiac disease, be confident that items labeled gluten-free meet a defined standard for gluten content. This is done by ensuring that consumers with celiac disease are provided with truthful, accurate, and not misleading labeling information to better assist them in identifying foods they can use when following a gluten-free diet. We also hope that it will benefit the food industry by establishing a level playing field among food manufacturers of products labeled gluten-free. Here I have provided the link to the published gluten-free food labeling final rule in the Federal Register. Also, I have a link to a list of useful question and answers related to the gluten-free food labeling final rule and other communication materials, including the constituent update that was released on August 5, 2014, a year after the gluten-free final rule was published. This constituent update informs the public that as of that date, all food labeled as gluten-free must now meet all the requirements of the gluten-free food labeling final rule. Before Suzanne begins her discussion on compliance, here are the results of the last poll question.
91%.
So 91% of you said that the answer was A, yes, your product may bear the gluten-free claim, only if it bears the appropriate disclaimer. So that was the correct answer. They would have to have that additional disclaimer that wheat has been processed to allow this food to meet the FDA requirements of gluten-free foods. Now I'll turn the presentation back over to Suzanne to discuss compliance, and please give us a minute to transition speakers.
I'm now going to discuss the last portion of this presentation on gluten-free food labeling, compliance of the final rule. On August 5, 2013, FDA issued a final rule to establish a regulatory definition of the term gluten-free. This is for voluntary use in labeling of packaged foods. The effective compliance date of this rule was August 5, 2014. Products labeled by the manufacturer prior to this compliance date that bear the claim gluten-free will not be subject to regulatory action by FDA. However, any product labeled by the manufacturer on or after August 5, 2014, bearing a gluten-free labeling claim that does not comply with the definition will be subject to regulatory action by FDA. FDA understands that some foods may have remained on store shelves after the final rule issued, and we would expect that products on the shelf now would be in compliance with the new regulation. To determine compliance based on analysis of the food, FDA will use a scientifically valid method that reliably detects 20 parts per million gluten in various food matrices. A food that bears a gluten-free, no gluten, free of gluten, or without gluten labeling claim will be deemed misbranded, and this falls under Section 403A1 201N of the Act, and if the food does not comply with the definition of gluten-free, which is found in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations under Section 101.91A. It will also be misbranded under the same section of the Act if the food bears the term wheat in the ingredient statement or in a contains wheat statement in its labeling as required by the Food Allergen Consumer Protection Act, and also bears a gluten-free claim unless the word wheat is followed by an asterisk that refers to the statement. The wheat has been processed to allow this food to meet the FDA requirements for gluten-free foods. This is found under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 101.91B, and Carol had referred to it earlier. Other terms regarding the absence of gluten will be evaluated under our general misleading and misbranding provisions. FDA will exercise enforcement discretion for FDA-regulated beers that currently make a gluten-free claim and that are made from a non-gluten-containing grain or made from a gluten-containing grain where the beer has been subject to processing that the manufacturer has determined will remove gluten. This enforcement discretion pertains only to beers subject to FDA's jurisdiction and that were making a gluten-free claim as of August 5th, 2013. And please note that FDA regulates non-malt beers. These are beers made without malted barley or hops, which Carol referred to earlier as well. Carol told you that we are getting ready to issue a proposed rule to establish how it will determine compliance for hydrolyzed and fermented foods, because the current ELISA methods cannot quantify gluten in these foods. In the interim, hydrolyzed and fermented foods that meet the definition may bear a gluten-free claim. Manufacturers can implement measures that are necessary to prevent the introduction of gluten into the food that will ensure that the finished product will comply with the definition. So how can consumers get involved with reporting issues that may come across concerning food labeled gluten-free? FDA has a consumer complaint system and MedWatch, which is available online at this website. This link will take the consumer through the steps of reporting a complaint to the FDA through the use of their consumer complaint coordinators or through MedWatch. Consumers and manufacturers can report any complaint, such as misuse of gluten-free claim on food labels, in the state where the product was purchased to their local FDA consumer complaint coordinator. Please see this website for a listing of your local consumer complaint coordinator. FDA has consumer complaint coordinators located throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. Consumers can report a problem with any FDA-regulated food to the consumer complaint coordinators. We encourage consumers to have the package available when reporting the product. And depending on the situation, an FDA investigator may visit the person who made the complaint, collect a sample, and possibly initiate an investigation. consumer can also use MedWatch to report adverse events, such as an unexpected side effect when using an FDA-regulated product. Every MedWatch report is recorded in an FDA database for review and comparison to similar products or reports. Consumers can report the adverse events to MedWatch via the phone at 1-800-FDA-1088, and this is available Monday through Friday between 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can also use an online voluntary reporting form, which is provided here at this link. And this form can be faxed to 1-800-FDA-0178 or through the mail address that I've listed here. The classification of recalls is done on a case-by-case basis, and it's based on various factors. Complaints can be made to the district complaint coordinators, which in turn can be brought to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition for consideration of a product recall. If you go to this website, you'll be able to get a list of current products that have been recalled, and I believe there's a listserv that you're able to get on if you want to be notified of any recalls. In terms of FDA enforcement, FDA routinely inspects food manufacturers for both good manufacturing practices as well as food labeling. If a food manufacturer violates the GMPs, the good manufacturing practices, or the food labeling regulations that are mandated by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the food is adulterated and misbranded, or it can be, and a warning letter may be issued. A warning letter specifically outlines the GMPs and labeling violations of the Act and gives the firm 15 working days to respond to the Food and Drug Administration. Failure to promptly correct the violations can result in seizures and/or injunctions. Although FDA has not yet issued a warning letter specifically concerning the new regulation on gluten-free, there was a warning letter that issued to this Nicola Pizza in June 2010. I am providing this example so the consumer and the public can see where FDA houses some of its enforcement actions, such as the warning letters on our website. The product in this warning letter was misbranded for various violations, including failure to declare the major food allergen wheat. You can go to our website and browse the warning letters by subject. And this is helpful if you are looking for a specific firm to see if a specific product may have been in one of our warning letters. Again, I want to emphasize that the gluten-free final rule applies to packaged foods. And as Carol stated earlier, FDA expects restaurants that choose to use gluten-free in labeling of their foods to be consistent with the federal definition. However, even though it applies to packaged foods, it's of public health significance, and we encourage the restaurant industry to be mindful of the use of gluten-free labeling. We also encourage consumers to inquire what gluten-free means in each restaurant and uses the gluten-free claim. FDA's Retail Food Protection Team works with stakeholders to revise the food code and to include issues such as food allergens and gluten-free. Please contact the agency's Information Center, which I provided here, for any retail food-related questions. And I've just provided here the general food labeling, gluten-free labeling of foods general webpage that lists many resources, but that is the general page. And I wanted to point out that the Guidance for Industry Gluten-Free Labeling of Foods Small Entity Compliance Guide is also a nice resource with some good questions and answers for both consumers and industry. And then finally, FDA has a designated mailbox for specific email questions concerning the gluten-free final rule, and I've listed that here. So this concludes our presentation on gluten-free food labeling. Carol and I are going to take some questions from the audience, but could you please give us a few minutes, and we'll compile those questions and get back to you. Thank you. So one of the questions was, how many companies indicate gluten is present in a factory or manufacturing line? The FDA really doesn't have any data on this, but it's not required. This would be voluntary information if a firm chose to put that kind of information on the food label. Another question was, does a gluten-free product that is naturally gluten-free need to be analytically tested to report less than 20 parts per million? And the answer to that is no. Again, if a gluten-free claim is used on a product, then all of the criteria of the gluten-free definition must be met. Another question was, FDA does not endorse symbols or logos, and they evaluate this on a case-by-case basis. Does this mean that labelers must contact FDA for such evaluation prior to using a symbol on their product? The use of these symbols and logos are normally done by certifying bodies, and they have their own testing to meet criteria of the gluten-free definition. Some of them may be less than 5 parts per million, and you can certainly contact that certifying body to see what their criteria are. But regardless of that logo that is put onto a food label, the food would be required to meet our definition. So we do tell consumers and manufacturers that you would be required, if you're going to voluntarily put this claim on there, you would be required to meet our definition. Another question was, must the claim gluten-free appear with a hyphen in between? I don't think technically we would have any issue with that. Again, we prefer that you use one of the 4 terms, and I'm sure there's going to be some manufacturers that may even misspell the word gluten, but I don't think technically we would take issue with the hyphen. So.
Okay, a question came in. Currently, can soy sauce be labeled gluten-free if it is made using hydrolyzed wheat? Since hydrolyzed wheat is an ingredient derived from a gluten-containing grain, we would not permit gluten-free labeling on such a soy sauce. So another question we saw, it says, so no new beers can be gluten-free, no formulas made after August 5th, 2013. And basically for beers made after August 5th, 2013 that want to have a gluten-free claim on them, the FDA regulated beers, we would exercise enforcement discretion so they are able to contact the FDA regarding their product. Another question is, please comment on whether the ingredients hydrolyzed wheat protein or hydrolyzed barley protein or hydrolyzed rye protein may be included in foods labeled gluten-free. And again, these are ingredients derived from a gluten-containing grain, and so we would not allow these ingredients in food labeled as gluten-free. But it would be helpful to see the rest of the label and get some more information on such products before making a final decision. Another question we got is, my understanding is that if a food labeled as gluten-free bears a voluntary statement such as may contain traces of wheat to indicate unavoidable traces of wheat that exist as part of a manufacturing process, no further disclaimer is required, such as the disclaimer that required for contains wheat, and such foods will not be considered misbranded. Is this correct? And the answer to this is yes, this is correct. May contain traces of wheat is advisory labeling, and we have a question like this in our question and answers, and we do say that we would allow it, but keep in mind that such labeling would be confusing, so it would be better to avoid such labeling. Okay, we got a question. What is FDA's preferred manner for declaring gluten-based ingredients that are in a factory or on the manufacturing lines, provided GMPs are followed? Again, advisory labeling is mainly for the food allergens, not for gluten. We wouldn't accept advisory labeling for gluten. We would just prefer adequate good manufacturing practices are followed. Another question we got is, how do you tell if maltodextrin added to foods has gluten? And then also the question is asking whether Splenda or Equal are safe for celiacs. I'm not really sure what these are made from, if they are made from gluten-containing grains. If they are, then depending on how they are made and if gluten is removed from them, the answer would depend on that. So I can't really answer that question definitively. And I'll turn it to Suzanne.
So we have a question on how are imported products checked for compliance with the gluten-free rule? Well, the FDA does look at domestic and imported products that are sold and packaged for the U.S. So we would look at them the same, and so I guess that kind of puts it to rest if you're feeling that maybe some of these imported products would not meet our definition, and some of them may not, and so a lot of them at times are labeled for other countries, in terms of even the nutrition label. So we do look at every component of the label. Another question was, are most food products marketed to persons with celiacs following this voluntary rule? Well, again, I think a lot of products that are out there that are labeled gluten-free, they have to meet our rule. You need to feel confident, I guess, if it's labeled gluten-free, that it meets our rule. But again, it is up to the manufacturer to ensure that. So we don't really have any data on knowing if most foods are marketed as gluten-free actually are following the rules. So another question was, no gluten-containing ingredients is on a package. Is this in violation? We would look at the label as a whole. So if they are making a gluten-free claim, trying to say that the product is gluten-free, it would be required to follow the rule. just stating no gluten-containing ingredients on the package really isn't in violation if they're not trying to be a gluten-free food. So again, we would look at the entire label to determine that. But if that's a truthful statement, it's just a truthful statement, and it has to be looked at as such. Okay, we're going to pause for a moment longer to check some more questions.
Thank you for bearing with us so far. Continue to submit your questions. If you feel like something has not been addressed, please submit your questions. Thank you.
We'll continue with a few more questions. If a product contains less than 20 parts per million gluten, but has a statement on the packaging that says it was manufactured in a plant that processes wheat, is this prior to testing for less than 20 parts per million or after? This would be specific to the product. We don't really know what the product is and how they handle their products, so it's hard to answer this question without some more information. Another question that we got is, yogurt contains fermented milk protein, not wheat protein. Why is it included in the fermented foods comment? Just because it is fermented overall? And yes, the yogurt, even though it is generally a product that wouldn't contain gluten, there are many manufacturers who want to label their product as gluten-free. This would be like an inherently gluten-free food. And they may be taking extra measures in their facility to ensure that their product doesn't come in contact with a product containing gluten if that is present. And this would be different from another yogurt manufacturer who didn't take such steps. So they want to differentiate their product from other yogurt products. So that's why yogurt and other such fermented foods would be included in the proposed rule that we are working on. Another question that we have is, can you describe the testing process to determine if someone is gluten-free or the cost? It's very hard to answer. A question like this is really dependent on the manufacturer, which testing labs the manufacturer sends their product to. Costs vary with location or labs or companies, so this doesn't really have a definitive answer. Does FDA have any issues with a company stating on the label made in a dedicated gluten-free facility? Made in a dedicated gluten-free facility, we wouldn't have any issues with this kind of a statement. I just want to remind you that gluten-free is a voluntary label, and it would depend on the manufacturer. Keep in mind that we made this rule to help individuals with celiac disease. Having complex labeling like this might confuse a patient with celiac disease. So we don't encourage these kind of statements. We would like more definitive statements to help patients with celiac disease. And we'll take another quick break to take a look at the last few questions.
Yeah, I think we're going to take, we have 10 minutes left in the webinar. We're going to take one more 5-minute break. This is going to give you a chance to ask your last few questions, and we will come back in 5 minutes and close out the webinar with final questions. Thank you very much. Okay, looks like we don't have that many more questions submitted, so we'll go over the last couple and close out the webinar.
So we got a question, how do you get third-party certification information for gluten-free claims? as we stated, the FDA doesn't endorse any third-party certification companies. So if you want to contact industry or, browse the internet for those, feel free to do that. And to get more information about what their criteria is. I did want to bring up another question that we've received, and maybe those didn't know how to ask it, but sometimes you may see the terms low gluten, very low gluten on a food label, and we had stated that we didn't define these terms in the final rule, and we felt that having a tiered gluten labeling claim would be confusing to those with celiac disease, and we did not have any scientific foundation for developing definitions for those terms. So again, if you see terms like that, it is confusing, and we prefer that the 4 terms that we listed are the terms that are used to know that the product is gluten-free. In addition to using those terms voluntarily, they must meet the criteria that we laid out today. I think that's it on the questions.
Okay. All right, we want to thank all of our participants for joining in today, and we'd like to thank our speakers for their presentation. We will be following up with an email after this webinar sometime later today that includes the email address that you can ask further questions and information on how to obtain your CPE credits. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.